Just as a quick preamble, because we have a lot to discuss here, this video will require some general knowledge of Elden Ring's story and, obviously, LGBTQ terms. So, fair warning, there will be spoilers, but also very little hand-holding. Unless you're Mohg, apparently. If you've watched any of my other videos recently and thought, I wonder why this guy hasn't uploaded in so long, it's because of Elden Ring. Ask a bunch of people I know and they'll tell you I've become somewhat obsessed over the last few years, and the characters and their lore play no small part in that. The stories in FromSoftware's games are designed to be ambiguous, but are also so compelling that the internet is awash with theories and speculation trying to make sense of the greater wholes. I think the reason people love the lore of Dark Souls and Bloodborne and Elden Ring in the most recent case so much is because to understand it in a way that even makes remote sense sometimes, it requires active engagement. You have to interact with it, and that interaction is what draws us to video games as an art form in the first place. The vast majority of these greater stories are made up of snippets in vestiges of the past, namely item descriptions. And so this is how fans web together in a way that makes sense to them these interconnected worlds of religion, history, the power struggles, the familial ties, and the never-ending search and covet of godhood, along with the tragedy that almost always culminates with the latter. After years, so much in Elden Ring still remains unanswered, and with the game's director, Hidetaka Miyazaki, having declared that he is moving on from the franchise, for now, we may never get answers to the most burning questions. Who was the Gloam-Eyed Queen? Was Marika really involved in the Night of Black Knives? And why is the fire giant so objectively terrible to fight? He's so big, you can't even see him as he pancakes you. Perhaps the most important question of all still remains unanswered. Why did Marika shatter the Elden Ring? We could go on and on and on, and the internet will. But after delving into more Elden Ring lore videos than I can count now, I want to examine a subject where I know the surface is barely scratched. How Elden Ring portrays LGBTQ identity. Of all the subject matter in this vast expanse, I think the reason I feel most compelled with this subject is because of how understated the impact of it is on the story, compared to how little discourse I see about the part these deeply embedded identities play in the unspoken motivations of some of its characters. The best way in any fictional universe to understand the context of relationships between characters is to contrast them against what is different in the world we know. And in the lands between, there are certainly some important distinctions we need to draw first. Perhaps the most important here is that the question of reproduction is almost wholly unaddressed. We know that gods and men alike beget children, but we don't know that copulation is necessarily required for this. The reason that I even bring this up is because most of the time, when Elden Ring addresses birth, death, or rebirth, it is in context of the Erd Tree, this world's cyclical, life-giving entity. The actual acts of sex or birth are, to my knowledge, almost non-existent in the lore, but do correct me down in the comments if I've missed a point or two by the end of the video. It's also important to highlight that questions of power structures in relation to gender are very different in the lands between compared to Western history in particular and much of pre-modern human history in general. This is because in order to become the consort of another character, questions of lineage to come and reproduction are seemingly unaffected or unimportant altogether. If your chosen tarnished character is female, your ultimate goal, to become the Elden Lord and claim your place as Marika's consort, is unchanged from if you chose a male identity. Claiming the first title of Elden Lady might have been a cool narrative addition, but FromSoft have made the title decidedly androgynous. Lord is a gender-specific historical title in Western history, but in the lands between, your gender matters not. Which now brings us to the word consort. This is probably where most players on this side of the world might get a little confused, because even in fantasy, it's not a common descriptor, and the word is used in Elden Ring's language frequently. Consort, however, is not a gendered term, and though it certainly would have been used historically to describe a heteronormative relationship relating to a monarch, and by extension that relationship's bearing of heirs, in Elden Ring, To be or to take a consort is purely about the joining of power. The Tarnished can choose to become Rani's consort and join their power with hers to usher in the Age of Stars. In myriad other endings where you win lordship, you become Marika's consort, or at least consort to what is left of her. That is, in true FromSoftware fashion, never properly explained. Though there are strong LGBTQ interpretations of a handful of Elden Ring's specific characters, all player character choices aside, there is one figure around which these interpretations mostly revolve, and he or she, perhaps depending on which part of them we are talking about, came to take center stage in the recent expansion. We all know that Miquella shrives clean the hearts of men, and is described by his twin as being the most powerful Empyrean of all, which, difficult as it is to believe, presumably includes Queen Marika herself. We know that he tried to cure Malenia's affliction of scarlet rot, and that his half-brother Mohg kidnapped him from the Halig tree in order to become his consort. This is almost certainly the first indication we get of a same-gender relationship where the question of power is not the only implication. Indeed, with the item description of the Remembrance of the Lord of Blood, we learn explicitly that no matter how much of his bloody bedchamber he tried to share, he received no response from the young Empyrean. So, this relationship is canonically sexual. When we encounter Mohg, he takes cocooned Miquella's hand as a lover would, calls him dearest, and laments that the Empyrean must abide alone a while, as though it pains him to be deprived of Miquella's company even for a moment. This kind of outward affection is rare in Elden Ring in any capacity, the only other moments of which come to mind being Godfrey's lamentations over his son Morgoth's death, or when Malenia calls out for none other than, again, Miquella, when finally bested in combat.
Oh, dear Miquella. Oh, dearest Miquella. My brother. I'm sorry. I finally met my match.
The latter is important to mention because we also know that, though the twin prodigies had a strong relationship, certainly one of mutual support and even admiration as differently afflicted siblings, it is certain that Miquella's true power was in beguiling those around him, i.e. the aforementioned shriving clean of hearts, and there is no evidence to suggest that even Malenia, whom Miquella loved more maybe than anyone, was not in some similar way beguiled. In the expansion, we learn from Ansbach that what happened with Miquella's kidnap at Mohgwyn Palace was, by all evidence he's found, all part of Miquella's greater plan. But we can't be certain of this. There is strong belief in the lore community that perhaps Miquella didn't plan his kidnap, but all the same used the circumstances and his charming abilities to meet the ends of his broader plan. Mohg then fell into the circle of Miquella's seduction, and Miquella used his body for... I'll get to that, of course. What is little known, even now, is what Miquella's precise relationship is to his other self, the abandoned self. In the base game, there are references to a figure we never see and rarely read of, called Saint Trina. The item description of the Sword of Saint Trina, which we should note here for future reference has the rare effect of inflicting sleep build-up, reads, Saint Trina is an enigmatic figure. Some say she is a comely young girl, others are sure he is a boy. The only certainty is that their appearance was as sudden as their disappearance. It was long speculated that there was a link between Miquella and Saint Trina, for example, the similarities between Miquella's lily and Saint Trina's lily, among other finds, and the expansion confirmed implicitly that they are indeed one and the same, or at least were. Needle Knight Leda claims,
St. Trina's love for kind Miquella is boundless. She is, after all, his other half. Or perhaps her feelings go beyond even that. Even if she was left behind, I doubt her heart would waver.
And Leda is here, I suspect, more right in what she says than what she realizes. St. Trina's feelings do go beyond that, because when we descend the stone coffin fissure, and find her abandoned here by Miquella in what is presumably the Land of Shadow's deepest point, her feelings are seemingly unclouded by any beguiling charm, and she pleads instead for mercy.
Miquella, stop. Don't turn the poor thing into a god. Godhood would be Miquella's prison. A caged divinity is beyond saving. You must kill Miquella. Grant him forgiveness.
What this suggests to me is that in his quest to ascend to godhood, Miquella believed he must shed himself not only of the burdens of his flesh and negative emotions, as we find discarded throughout the Land of Shadow, but his other personality entire. What is Miquella actually doing in this process? Abandoning the part of him that is female? We could ask that question in both the literal and figurative sense. One interpretation could be that Miquella is rejecting the duality of his nature as impure. We will come to the link that he may well have been wary with in relation to his mother, Marika, shortly, but if he knew the true ramifications of that duality, did this come into his calculations also, perhaps? We know that Miquella was born male and that his dream self appeared of uncertain gender, so is Miquella trying to cast off the dream of a trans ideation he once had? What we can be sure of is that Miquella wanted to shed himself of St. Trina in Godhood's pursuit, and was so callous as to leave her in the deepest, darkest pit he could find. The part of him abandoned makes it clear that it is better that Miquella should die without her than achieve his goal, lest he be beyond saving. It is emblematic, to me at least, of a kind of internal gender identity struggle, because, if not, why make so clear a distinction as to make one part of Miquella male and the other female? This, of course, culminates in Miquella descending the Divine Gate, where he and Radahn proceed to pulsate the earth with enough holy light to nuke a hole through my PlayStation 400 times until, finally, we defeat what was for me the most difficult boss in any game I think I've ever played. I was on New Game Plus 8 though, so no real surprise there. But the crux of this, of course, is that Miquella chooses Radahn as his consort. Even though I said earlier the word consort is generally for more of a joining of power than to indicate any sexual or romantic union, there is a degree of intimacy in this that is not seen anywhere else in this universe. Miquella has Radahn carry him on his back, with Miquella clutching tightly to his neck. It could of course be implied that Miquella is merely whispering his influence into Radahn's ear, cementing his certain power he has over him. But I think the interpretation here can indeed be broad enough to suggest that Miquella sees this relationship as more than other unions we've seen or read about in the Lands Between so far. Rani merely has us bend the knee and give her a ring, and Marika, well, I guess we have to assume she's still a mummified husk at the time we claim the title of Elden Lord, so there's certainly no intimacy we can divine there. The other question that the community is fussing over vehemently right now is Radahn even complicit in this? Was he ever complicit? When we touch the memory left in Miquella's wake, we see his plea to a younger Radahn, but we never hear from Radahn himself. There is no indication that Radahn ever wanted to be part of Miquella's plan, apart from this mention in Miquella's memory.
Lord brother, if we honour our part of the vow, promise me you'll be my consort. I'll make the world a gentler place.
This is certainly one of the most loaded sequences in the expansion, because it suggests that Radahn did at one stage have some agreement with Miquella, but this vow that Miquella mentions is independent from the promise, i.e. the promise to be his consort. What, we are all furiously curious to know, was the vow? We don't know. There are lots of ideas floating around the community, and some, I think, have merit, but alas, they are outside the scope of this video. One confirmation we do have is that in the reveal trailer for Elden Ring, all the way back in 2019, the words that Malenia whispered to Radahn were, "Miquella awaits thee, O promised consort." Which, for one sentence, reveals a whole lot we otherwise wouldn't know. It means that the reason he and Malenia fought was, all this time, in service of Miquella's designs. Something else that convinces me that Malenia's love for her brother may have been partly beguiled, because what a f***ing wild plan, right? This is all getting a little complicated now, so let's frame a few things. Radahn was asked by Miquella to make a promise to be his consort, but we don't know that he ever made that promise. Either way, Miquella had his sister essentially assassinate their half-brother so he might become the promised consort. But she didn't finish the job. We, the Chosen Tarnished, did. When Miquella stepped through the Divine Gate, presumably performing a rite at least somewhat in line with what Marika did herself, Radahn was revived to be both Miquella's lord and the enforcer of his supposed 1,000-year voyage. So Miquella is certainly the body around which all of this orbits, and in pursuit of godhood and making the world a gentler place, as he professes, there is in the background questions of queer coding and trans identity that are certain, but ultimately never explored in any way that is tied to Miquella's motivations. And I think that is where we fall down in trying to be certain of what it means to the wider story. It's because we can't attribute motivation or desire to certain choices that we can't be sure how Miquella really identifies, at least other than as a well-intentioned villain who wants to enforce world peace by charming every living thing into servitude. I omitted earlier one of Elden Ring's most enduring mysteries. Whether Marika and Radagon were always one and the same. We know from several different sources in-game that Radagon is Marika. In fact, that's a direct quote, because if you use the law of regression incantation in front of a statue of Radagon in Leyndell, it will transform into a Marika statue, and a message will appear that literally states this. Interestingly, if you boot the 1.0 version of the game, there is no message, and you have to be a lot closer to trigger the transformation, so it does seem that FromSoft decided in early patches that they wanted this secret to be more accessible than first intended. But with other direct references to Radagon and Marika as the same being, the wording is unusual, to say the least. When Melina relates to us one of Marika's spoken echoes, she says,
"O Radagon, leal hound of the Golden Order, thou art yet to become me. Thou art yet to become a god. Let us be shattered, both, mine other self."
On first glance, one might assume that this settles the question of whether Radagon and Marika were always the same person, specifically, thou art yet to become me. But referring to him as mine other self contradicts this in the very next line. So ultimately, we can't derive any certainty here. It's always possible, of course, that Radagon was always a part of Marika, but split from the rest of her and was later rejoined with, presumably after Radagon's relationship with Rennala, but we simply don't have enough information to make a sound judgment either way. We do know that at the time Marika shattered the Elden Ring, they were the same, because as Marika moved to shatter it, Radagon tried to repair it. Even though we don't know exactly why, it is certain that, at the least, they were in conflict, much as was evidently the case with Miquella and St. Trina. Again, the trans and non-binary interpretations of this are compelling. A struggle of identity pivoting around opposite genders. One body, different desires, different people. I think what's wonderfully symmetrical about these narratives of Marika and her son are just how similar their paths became. Both are Empyreans, both cast off, or attempted to cast off, an other self, and both use the same divine gate, though not necessarily in the same way. Having collated all this now, it's evident that queerness and non-binary identity are, though not a central element to Elden Ring's narrative, still inseparably important to it. Through what is mostly the lens of godhood, of divinity, it explores the transcending of rigid gender definitions, characters with both masculine and female attributes, and a blurring of traditional roles, and in small ways, even sexualities. Though I think there is so much that can be readily framed as simple duality in these characters, that duality is enmeshed in contexts of sex and gender that underscore issues in our world, and that's part of what makes video games undeniable art. So much of Elden Ring's story is about subversion and rebellion, and so of course this is reflected in characters who, out of their otherness, desire expression. And of course, the thing that they desire just as much, and which makes up the most prominent part of the story, the desire for power, which, as I mentioned, is not ever in its acquisition without sacrifice and tragedy, not least of all in respect of one's identity. Wow, that was so much to unpack, and apologies that the nature of the lore makes so many tangents inevitable in writing this script, but we got there. Thank you so much for everyone watching, and please go give the video a like. Leave a comment if you think there's anything I might have missed, because there's plenty I inevitably have. This has been far and away my longest video so far, so I'm going to go help some people defeat the promised consort, and I'll see you in the next one.